Our first program today is the Colorado Building Performance Standards Implementation Session. This features Jeff Elsner, Associate of the RMH Group, over here. Paul Hutton, Principal Director of Regenerative Design at Cunningham Group Architecture. Tom Poling, Director of Energy and Sustainability at U.S. Engineering Service. And Stephen Shepard, Executive Director of the Denver Metro Building Owners and Managers Association. Welcome our panelists, and Paul, I assume you're leader.
I guess I get to start, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. So we're going to talk today, and welcome to our presentation, about Colorado Building Benchmarking and Performance Standards, BPS, we often call it. And I was fortunate enough to be the only architect on both the state task force for BPS and Denver's CASR setting similar standards. So interesting perspective have been on those two similar but also different programs. As we get started today, it's fun to be talking to a group of engineers. Normally, because of my role, I talk to lots of architects. So what's really exciting about this for me is that enables me to include some things in this presentation I normally couldn't show my architectural colleagues, and that would be charts and graphs. They tend to get kind of nervous when they see those kind of things. All right, let's jump in, if we can figure out the remote. Oh, no, wrong one. Try again. Might have to have you come fix this. We'll see. Okay, so let's try this one.
Right button.
Right button. All right, so here's our agenda today. As we mentioned, we're going to try to leave enough time at the end for some robust Q&A. So we have a lot of content to cover. Hopefully we'll get to most of your questions. So unless it's urgent, I'll ask you to hold it, and then we'll have a lot of time at the end. So this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about. Let you look at that for just a minute. I don't need to read that to you. So let's just jump right into the actual content. So this journey actually starts in 2019 with the passage of House Bill 1261. And that was a legislation that put into place Colorado's first greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. And if you look at the numbers on the screen, they were pretty aggressive. 50% reduction in GHG emissions for the state by 2030, and all the way to 90% by 2050. And by the way, this is due to be updated in 2024. So that's what started this. Now, following up on that, 2 years later, another piece of legislation, this one, 1286, was passed and signed by Governor Polis. And this one specifically addresses energy use in all the existing buildings across the state. And you'll see all is a little too all-encompassing. We'll talk to you about what actually qualifies initially. But now here you see we start to get into sector-specific greenhouse gas emissions targets. They are much less ambitious than what you were seeing for the overall state. So in this sector, we're talking about a 7% reduction in 2026 and a 20% reduction by 2030. Very important to understand, it's the Air Quality Control Commission, the ACEC, that actually set the rules. So the task force that some of us were on simply made recommendations. Those recommendations went to ACEC. Those folks debated it for a long time, took a lot of input and testimony, and finally came out with the rules that were very recently released. So that's what we'll be sharing with you today. The entire program will be managed by the state's energy office. They've hired a lot of folks and expertise to try to run this program. It'll be interesting to see how they do with all of that, because I think it's going to be a challenge. And reporting will be through Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So those of you who are energy managers, Stephen, go ahead.
Well, I just want to point out on this one from the perspective of building owners, I think that it's that 2021 benchmarking number and getting that accurate EUI target number is really hard, and that's what's going to be difficult as you're working potentially with your clients at assuring that they can reach the goals, because we don't even know. With 2021, we all know occupancy was nowhere near what it was before. So I just think that that is the key piece of it. And when you start looking at getting alternative pathways and all those kinds of things, that's where you're going to be able to help guide clients potentially, is making sure that what is the reality of those EUI numbers and greenhouse gas targets.
Yeah, it's a very important point. Using 2021 as the baseline year is a really interesting choice, subject of a lot of debate. Certainly a better choice than 2020, when there were really drastic COVID implications. The thinking was by 2021, things were rebounding, and it was, we all understood it was a compromise, but that's what was selected. So our task force put together a series of goals and outcomes. We've already talked about the sector-wide piece, but there were some other things that are important to share. It's critical to the task force and those involved with the program that the new performance standards share these attributes. They're equitable, they're focused on low carbon or carbon emissions reduction, and trying to use as much clean energy as possible. And on the right-hand side, talking about the process. Again, the focus is purely on reducing greenhouse gas pollution, but also trying to achieve the goals of lower energy costs. And that's going to be controversial because, as we all know, when we get to electrification, there are times that becomes especially challenging. And also the final piece about improving indoor air quality, that relates absolutely to electrification and the removal of natural gas for cooking and heating. Oh, and I should mention too, this sector-wide emissions, really important to understand, this includes the addition of new buildings. So 7% and 20% might not seem terribly aggressive, but we have to understand that's for the whole sector. And we have to hit those targets even after we factor in the new buildings being built between now and those target dates. So really important to recall that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom. Oh, you got your own mic. I'll turn this one off.
I'll take the other. Yeah, I'll take the other side. Thanks. Okay, so who is under the program? So that what they call covered buildings are all buildings that are greater than 50,000 square feet. This equates to a little over 8,000 buildings in the state of Colorado. It does not include the ones that are listed below. So storage facilities, aircraft facilities, parking garages, single family homes, and buildings that are more than half of the gross floor area is manufacturing, industrial, or agricultural. I think they'll come out with some additional technical guidance on especially the MAI buildings here in the next year, but for right now, a lot of those are exempt. So we know exactly where the buildings are. We know the addresses. We know where you live, right? So there's a map, and the link is at the bottom, where you can get online and you can see all the buildings that are considered covered buildings. So from the benchmarking standpoint, no surprise, they're using Energy Star Portfolio Manager as the tool to upload benchmarking data. And this is a real focus, I think, of all of us, you know, in the consulting and construction world, is working with your customers, especially the ones that are covered buildings, to make sure that their benchmarking data is up to date, making sure that for those that are in utility territories like Xcel, you can get them connected directly and automatically to Xcel or Holy Cross, or there's a list of Colorado utilities that have automatic uploads available directly to the customer. But I think it's a real focus of ours, especially, I mean, we're having conversations with the customers now. The window for reporting for next year starts March 1st and ends June 1st. And every customer is required to submit their benchmarking information directly to the state and pay a $100 fee for the joy of turning this all in. Right?
And Tom, one quick thing on that is that if you're in Denver, if your client is in Denver, Boulder, or Fort Collins, benchmarking's already been required in those cities. And so the cities are reporting the benchmarking to the state on behalf of the property owner, but the property owner still has to go online and pay the $100 fee. And representing building owners, I can tell you there's a lot of building owners out there that don't know all of these little intricacies that we're going over today. So this will make you look like a hero when you can tell them what they need to do.
Yeah, Aspen, I think, is the other municipal in Colorado that has a benchmarking program in addition, and they're usually additive, right? It's not you do one or the other. Unfortunately, you get to do both if you're an owner in those municipalities. So here's a pretty detailed slide on the timeline of the program. Up above are the deadlines tied to benchmarking. See if the thing reaches that far over. And then the bottom half is for building performance standards, right? So here's the timeline starting in 2021. Paul mentioned that's when the law went into effect with House Bill 21-1286. The task force had put together their recommendations in 2022. And like Paul said, the Air Quality Control Commission approved those rules in August, and the technical guidance was just published a couple of weeks ago. And so all of this is hot off the press. From a benchmarking standpoint, the baseline is still established in 2021. And so the expectation with the state is that, again, the reporting starts March 1st of every year and concludes June 1st. So we need to be getting all of these covered buildings, all the benchmarking data submitted to the state. And you can see it basically happens every year for eternity, essentially. I haven't said when to stop, but 2050 is the last date on the guidance. So just getting folks into the cadence of submitting this data, right? So a real focus soon. So you are here, right? And so the next deadline is benchmarking for 2024. As far as building performance standards are concerned, the interim dates that you're looking for next are 2026, and then a final date at 2030 as far as that benchmarking information, where the state will now review that information and decide whether you're in compliance or not. And Jeff will talk a little bit more about the program and what that constitutes here in a minute. So some dates to really pay attention to coming up, again, beyond the benchmarking dates every year. The next one that's coming up is December 31st, 2025. If there's any alternative compliance plans that need to be put in place on behalf of your customers, that's when they need to be filed by, because the data, the real data that everybody's looking for, right? The green, we're in the practice laps here the next couple of years, but the real data that they're going to look at starts January 1st of 2026 through December 31st of 2026. So at that point, when you submit your data the next year, the calendar year benchmarking data, that's when the state will look at it to see if you're in compliance, right? So again, you're wanting to make sure that that data is as clean as possible by 2026. Because in 2027, they'll look at the data and then they'll start to put out non-compliance notices by then, which again, we'll talk about what that all entails in a minute. And then the same story will happen for 2030, right? So your alternative compliance needs for that target needs to happen right before 2030 starts, right? Then the new data, this is the final target data that they'll look at. And then again, the non-compliance will go out at that point. Does that make sense? There's kind of a lot of moving parts, but that's basically the big dates to worry about. Okay.
So what exactly do building owners have to do in 2026? For the compliance pathways for this, there are 3 main compliance paths to follow. And the first one, the energy efficiency pathway, is familiar to those of you who are familiar with the city of Denver's approach and their building performance standard. It's reduce your energy use down to a specific target. So looking on the chart on the right, that's the yellow line. Depending on your building type, you'll have a specific EUI target to meet. And no matter where you start to follow this compliance path, you have to get down to that target. So we measure EUI in kBTUs per square foot per year. And so if you're looking on the graph at the right, you get 2 examples, an office building that starts at 100 and an office building that starts at 60. So the office building at 100 is using almost twice as much energy as the one at 60 per square foot. The first target for that specific building type would be 57.2. So that building that's 60 has to reduce energy just a small amount. The building that's at 100 has to take off quite a bit. And so that 2026 target is a fixed number that the building would need to come down to. And then similarly, there's a 2030 target, same thing, the target's lower, but it's a fixed number. So that yellow line is kind of the glide path for a building that is a building following that compliance path and starting at 60. Also important to note that following that compliance path, you do have to maintain in between. You can't make it for 1 year and then pop your energy back up. That's not the intent. And that pathway is going to be the easiest one for high performing buildings because they're already closer to the target. The second pathway that's described in the green box is actually quite similar, but it is not based on EUI, it's based on greenhouse gas emissions. And so instead of tracking to a target level for overall energy use, which doesn't really care whether you're burning gas or electricity or where that's coming from, you can also track to a specific target for greenhouse gas emissions. So for buildings that are looking at electrification, this may be a better target. It may not be. It's going to depend on a lot of factors and details. But that is the other potential pathway, is come down to a greenhouse gas target, emissions target. And then there's a third pathway that simply says take off 13% by 2026 from your 2021 baseline, and by 2030 you have to take off 29%. And again, those are intended to be maintained, so you can't come down 15% and then go back up 10% and stay in compliance. So that standard reduction pathway is likely to be the easier pathway for already poor performing buildings, because you don't have to come down as far. Those targets, that 13% and that 19%, to what Paul said, that's higher than the 7% and 20% goal, because we're making up for additional buildings and additional energy use and emissions that are being added to the built environment as buildings are built within the state. So those are the three main pathways, the three main ways to get to compliance. And for all of them, the 2026 date is an interim target. It's halfway between that and the final target. We keep getting more stringent from 2026 to 2030. So this is a sampling of different property types and both their site EUI, so the kBTU per square foot, the energy target to get down to, in both 2026 and 2030, and then the greenhouse gas intensity, that target is on the right-hand side. So you can see the more intense building types have higher targets. So something like a K-12 school, those targets, are in the mid 50s down to the upper 40s by 2030, versus a hospital which starts in the low 200s and is down to 172 by 2030. And similarly, those greenhouse gas emissions intensity targets move down as well from 2026 to 2030. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of the interplay between electrification and the greenhouse gas emission targets and also the EUI targets. So electrification is in no way required by the building performance standard. You can meet this standard without changing one bit of gas-fired equipment to electric equipment. The standard does not require that to happen. And that's a point that many times you'll hear from people who do not understand the details of this, is that, oh, we're required to electrify. And that's not the case. However, electrification does help meet targets. So just in terms of looking at this from an EUI standpoint, if you swap out gas-fired equipment that's 85% efficient and you put in a straight electric resistance boiler that's 100% efficient, you've gained a little bit on your EUI. If you swap that out for a heat pump that has an average COP of 3, you've gained a lot on your EUI. And so electrification can help meet goals on both the EUI side and on the greenhouse gas emission side as well. And the reason it helps on the greenhouse gas emission side is that our electric grid is improving. So Xcel Energy, their 2022 mix, you can see that in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, there's still a big chunk of coal in there. And so the emissions from electricity are high because emissions from coal-fired power plants are quite high. Natural gas also has considerable emissions. And then you've got the 42% that's carbon free. As we move towards 2030, that mix is going to change. Almost all the coal is going to drop out. Natural gas may increase a little, may decrease a little, but the renewables are also going to eat up a bigger slice of that pie. And the chart on the right shows electrical grid emissions and how they're projected to fall. That chart on the right also shows natural gas emissions for heating. And if you look at where we are right now, if you can see kind of where we are between 2021 and 2025, if you install an electric boiler today to replace a gas boiler, your emissions go up, because the electrical grid is not clean enough to provide that energy at a lower emissions rate than natural gas today. That changes sometime around 2028, 2029. And now an electric boiler is a better emissions performer than gas. But what everybody really is encouraging you to do, what the state would like to see out of this, is a shift from natural gas to heat pump heating instead of electric resistance, which you can see that orange line. Switching to a heat pump already improves emissions and will continue to improve emissions over natural gas going forward. It just gets better and better. So for electrification, it's going to help meet either an EUI target or a greenhouse gas emissions target. And so while it's not required, it can be a powerful tool towards getting into compliance with the building performance standard.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
I just wanted to make one quick comment on that. That's part of the reason we're telling our members to track every single thing they're doing, document it, what the cost is, what the result was. But to the point, there are building systems where Denver looked at typology of equipment. The state didn't go down to that level. So we do know that there are buildings who have current equipment that can't be electrified yet. So I think as you're looking at those heat pumps or things like that, that might be able, what is the cost of that if the equipment's not at end of life, so that you have those estimations to show what is the potential estimate of what that would do to get you to the rest of the way to your goals? Because all of that data is going to be important when the state comes back and says, you know what, you didn't reach your targets by, enough. And so we're going to start fining you, County of Denver as well. That data should help push back to get them to say, hey, you've been doing everything you can, because these targets, there's even ACEC commissioners that don't know that those targets are actually achievable, and voiced that publicly when we were going through so I just want to make sure that. And then I've got buildings that they can't even get EV charging stations in their buildings because there's not enough load to come to the building. So that's the other option. So we need to be able to show that if you can't get the load, why, and how much would that cost? So making sure you're looking at all those nuances to help show what we could do to get the rest of the way, even though they can't, is going to be a key to this piece of it, I think.
It is, and it's a good segue into some of the alternate compliance pathways that are out there. So some of these are already kind of ensconced in the technical guidance, and some of them are not as clear yet on how they'll be applied and what you'll need to do to get there. So the first one up there, installing on-site renewable generation, is pretty straightforward. If you slap a bunch of solar panels on top of the building, you can use that to lower the building's EUI to make a target. Similarly, the greenhouse gas emissions will come down as well to make one of those targets, or to make your percent decrease. So that one's easy. It's already kind of, the path to doing that's already kind of laid out within the technical guidance. Similarly, purchasing off-site renewables can help reach those goals. That's also described in the technical guidance. And then we start to get into the weeds and where things have been a little less well-defined. So looking at buildings that have more than, or owners that have more than one building, there may be the possibility for a portfolio type approach in order to do that. The building compliance, or the building performance standard in the city of Boston, has this, where if you look at your portfolio of buildings and you say, look, I can save 50% in this building and I can only save 12% in this building for the same cost, well, go save the money where it's most economical, or go save the energy where it's most economical. And so there may be a possibility to work that with the state. There may be a possibility to do energy auditing to see what the best achievable EUI is and have a target adjustment. In the technical guidance, they say they're going to come out with more target adjustments and things based on schedule, based on specific energy users that may exist in a building. Denver did this. Denver has several standard target adjustments. The state does not have those yet. They're supposed to come out in 2024. So that may be a path. And certainly once you fall out of compliance, one of the ways to get back into compliance is to do an audit and to get some quotes on different projects and show that you're working towards your energy savings to get yourself back into compliance and stop receiving penalties, which we'll talk about in a minute. A timeline adjustment or a target adjustment, that is one of the, that relates right back to what Stephen had been saying, is that if you have equipment that's not yet at end of life and you say, look, I would really like to go to 2028 instead of having a target at 2026 because I'm going to swap out that equipment when it reaches end of life, you may be able to get a timeline adjustment for when that building needs to come into compliance. And then hardship waivers, so far the only thing that's really been mentioned on that is for lower income buildings. So disadvantaged buildings may be able to get some waivers for this. So what are the penalties for this? So first of all, benchmarking starting in 2021, had to submit benchmarking. If you fail to do so, they charge you $500. If you fail to do so again, they charge you $2,000, and that occurs annually. When we get to the performance standards, so starting in 2026, the first violation of that, so if you miss your target, if you miss whatever compliance path you were trying to take, you don't get there. They're going to charge you $2,000 for the first violation and $5,000 for each after that. The way they're looking at a violation is that if your first violation occurs when you miss that building performance target, they're going to consider it a subsequent violation every month you don't show them that you're working towards that goal. So if you do nothing, if you miss the target and do nothing at all, they're going to charge you $5,000 a month. It'll be $60,000 a year. Key difference from the Denver performance standard is they don't care how much you miss the target by. If you were 1 kBTU over, you miss the target. They also don't care how big your building is. So the fine for a 52,000 square foot building is the same as for a 600,000 square foot building. There's no adjustment for building size. The regulation, that monthly fine structure, could still change. It needs to be, the fines are intended to be enough to drive compliance. The city of Denver did a very good job of explaining why their fines were the way they are. They said, look, this is we're going to make sure these fines are a little more than the cost of actually complying. And they haven't said so, but my expectation is they base that on, all right, how much does it cost to go buy a kBTU of solar for a year? That's the simplest compliance path to put a number to. Because every building is unique, so actually saving energy in a building, figuring out how much it's going to cost to do that is very hard, but it's very easy to see what's the going rate for a certain amount of energy with solar. These penalties have nothing to do with that. They are somewhat more arbitrary. So additional penalties could be coming. Public buildings don't have to pay penalties. They're technically subject to this, but will never be required to pay a penalty. So the public universities in the state are off the hook on penalties. The private universities are not.
Jeff, they do say something about unless you do a renovation over $500,000, then you might be under the penalty clause.
On the public building.
On public.
If you do. Okay, yeah, you're right. There was something in there about that. And then the penalties, you're paying in, if you pay penalties, you're paying into the climate change mitigation and adaptation fund. So kind of wrap that section up. We have some resources where you can go to find more information. The benchmarking map again is the second one down, where the Building Performance Colorado website, the Air Quality Control Commission, the AQCC, has now wrapped this into Regulation 28, and so there's a link there where that goes. And then the technical guidance for the performance standard is out now as well, and that's the link to that.
Just a quick slide here to interject a comment, and that is that we're often asked, with new building and energy codes advancing as much as they have, City of Denver and many municipalities in Colorado are using the most recent codes. Why do we need to care about this? Can't we just let the codes do their job? And of course, the problem is that there isn't a mechanism in the code that forces existing buildings to improve. And that's really the reason. So this chart from our friends at 2030 makes a great point. In the year 2040, looking ahead, in that year, 2/3 of the buildings we will have then already exist today. So even if every new building were net zero energy, which is highly unlikely, we still wouldn't solve the greenhouse gas emissions problem. We have to find a way to tackle the existing buildings that continue to emit greenhouse gases. And some of the older ones, some of the poor performing ones, substantial amounts of greenhouse gas compared to newer buildings. One other comment I wanted to make here, though, too, and I think all of us as design professionals should look at this very carefully. One of the things we're starting to ask ourselves in our firm is, do these constitute almost a de facto code? So if you're designing a new building right now, should you be designing your energy efficiency to today's current code? Should you be designing to the 2026 standards in your city or state? Should you perhaps even be looking at the 2030 standards? Because who among us wants to be in a situation where in 2026, a building owner calls us and says, hey, the building you told me was up to code, I'm now paying a fine because it's not meeting that. So this could even be considered to constitute a new standard of care for many of us design professionals. So a lot of interesting conversations, I'm sure, will be happening around this topic. Who's gonna, I guess you're gonna do this one, Steve.
I get the easy ones. So one of the other challenges, and I think that this is going to be, we all know that there's challenges with workforce, right? So you're going to be working with a client, it's supply chain, all those other things, again, documenting the challenges that you're having with the plans that, you know, you have this project that's supposed to be done in 2025, and now all of a sudden it's the middle of 2026. Those are the kinds of things, because as you can see, they're estimating by 2027, we're still going to be short some number of construction employment. Building Jobs for Colorado is a great group that's really trying to focus on this, make sure legislators understand that workforce development. From our perspective too, it's the building engineer. We're running short on getting building engineers, and if we don't have quality building engineers running the building, you guys can design the greatest building in the world, but if it's not run properly, is it going to be running as efficiently as it needs to be to meet the goals? And so that's the other part of the challenge that we're facing when we talk about workforce development. And so, you know, we've been trying to recruit new stocks of building engineers because we're starting to have the retirements happen, as in most industries. And it's not, hasn't been an industry that people realize is even there. And as we know, building engineers are a great living wage job, right? I mean, a chief engineer at some of these buildings is going to be in the top end of 6 figures, right? The other piece that I think, my members are going to be those more sophisticated, the CBREs and the Hines and all of that. So, but there's a huge stock of building out there. And we've tried to work with through Paul and I, through stuff with the Building and Home Subcommittee, the Sustainability Advisory Council, to reach Class B and C buildings. And BOMA worked with ULI to create a sustainability program on B and C. Those are the folks that are not going to understand where it comes down and how they need to connect in with their tenants. And so this is another place I think that I wanted to make sure that you all understood. You could provide some counseling for some of your clients of those smaller buildings to make sure they understand that they're going to have to bring tenants into this, and helping tenants understand why things are happening in the property to reduce those energy costs. So whether it's that you know, they've been trying to keep out that lighting retrofit or, you know, those kinds of things that are going to help those targets, helping them understand now there's these mandatory projects and having green teams. The lease, what can they get done in the lease that's going to help force the tenants to help be part of the plan to reduce that energy use, especially as they're renewing. So when you look that the buildings are responsible for 50 to 75% of that energy use, but the rest of that, as you can see, there's still a big percentage that has the tenant as that uncontrollable part of that property and what's going on. And I think making sure that that property owners understand that this is going to be part of the solution is going to be key to being able to be successful in the end.
All right, so I just wanted to bring it home with just a couple of case studies. When we were doing the testimony on behalf of Colorado Real Estate Alliance and KHEAD, we were trying to figure out what is the scope. I mean, what's ahead of us is really unprecedented in the amount of work that's ahead of us, you know, in the design community and the construction community. And so we were trying to get a handle on, okay, let's just take one building type. There's 80 building types that are defined within the guidance. This happens to be hospitals. So these are all of the hospitals that reported their benchmarking data for 2021. And so you can see where the average lies with all hospitals. You can see where the 2026 target is at 217, and then the 2030 target. So you can get kind of an idea of, just for the hospital industry only, what lies ahead of just them, and then extrapolate to everybody else, right? So interesting things when you look at data at this level. One is, first of all, this is only about half of the hospitals. There's 100 hospitals in the state of Colorado, only about 50 of them reported. So that's, again, step one is work with your clients to make sure their benchmarking is into the state. The penalties will start to hit in 2024 for noncompliance to benchmarking. They haven't yet, but they will. The second thing we noticed, and I've been in the business 30 years, and I've always wondered, and I've had questions about what is an average hospital anyway, right? The benchmarking is not new, right? We've been chasing this down for decades. What's cool about this, I think, from the engineering standpoint, is now we're getting data in to really know what is good and bad. So from a hospital standpoint, for what has been reported, the average hospital is around 225 kBtu a square foot. But you can also see the outliers, right? So what's interesting is to look at the hospitals. They call themselves hospitals, probably not hospitals when you really look at some of the names, right? So they're probably more like urgent care clinics or things like that, right? So cleaning up that side of it is important. And then, of course, you know, looking at the high end too, and looking at the opportunities to get to that standard reduction number lies ahead of us. So just an interesting exercise to look at this at scale, and then again extrapolate it to 8,000 buildings throughout the state. The roadmap, the game plan for energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction hasn't appreciably changed, you know, in the last few years. The roadmap to get there is probably not surprising, right? You know, doing the benchmarking, doing the planning, doing the operational short-term payback EMs, tax on the renewables, and then go after the equipment upgrades and the systematic improvements. Number one, and I think one of the benefits we got out of the testimony or out of the rules making process was, keep in mind the timing is coming immediately, right? You have 2 years to audit thousands of buildings to give the state the reason to fine or not to fine, right? And then to do that, to get the budgeting in place, to actually have an owner do something, and then to look at existing equipment and say, well, you know, we would not recommend to replace anything until the end of the service life, right? So the argument back to the Air Quality Control Board was to say, here's a realistic timeline of improvement. 2030 is your timeline, but you know, we're really only going to get so far with budgets and planning by 2030. Everything else, major renovations and things, are going to happen afterwards, which they agreed with. And so that's why, you know, compliance planning and putting in those alternate compliance options is so key here in the next 2 years for this group to be worrying about. And the other side of it too was there was arguments over whether this was an achievable goal as a state. The state is saying that the investment to get to compliance is on the order of a couple $1 billion, right? $2.3 billion. So my argument was, okay, let's just look at a hospital. And again, so this is the assumption of an average hospital, average size. So 300, 400,000 square foot hospital running about 250 kBs a square foot. If you do the major, the normal phases of this is how we're going to walk them through and get them to compliance. We're going to do the benchmarking and the audits and the facility assessments. Then we're going to start getting the low hanging fruit, and then we're going to all these things, right? So this is our argument back to the state, was to say, yeah, we can get there, right? This is my pathway to 28, 29%, right? If I do a little bit of this and this and this, right? But I'm going to have to tell my customer, in this case, it's a $20 million investment to get you to a 28 or 29% savings. Not impossible, but where's the money coming from? So the argument was back to affordability and equity of these rules, right? And so there's a lot of back and forth, right? We're sort of in the grace period in the next 2 years of let's see what we can do to get you there until litigation starts to kick in and fines and so forth. So I think all of us in this room are sort of in that mode of how can we make a difference, and so how do we help our clients get there? So some things to consider was already mentioned. Paul already mentioned, right, that code minimum is probably not your bogey anymore, right? Especially for state projects over 50,000 square feet, right? It's important to talk to your customers, to talk to your design teams about these EUI targets. I mean, again, as a construction company, we're having VE conversations all the time about, are you sure you really want to design to that? And let's make sure we tell our customers why the EUI targets, we don't want any surprises, right? So planning is key. And the next 2 years, there is a lot of work ahead of all of us to get there. It's important to engage with the state early. That was one of the things that we discovered as the Energized Denver program was rolling out. There's sort of this idea of, well, we'll hide in the weeds and we'll just pay our fines and that'll be it, right? And so, but the conversations that we had with the city were, these are the real problems that our building owners are facing. How do we define that for you so that you don't, it's to the state, this is a math problem, right? 7% in 3 years, now almost 2 years, 20% in 6 years, right? That's the way they look at it. Every testimony that came across the states, you could tell the difference between the owner side and the consultant side, or the activist side, right? Every owner to the world was saying, we want to do the right thing, but it's a $20 million thing. So making sure we're talking to the state early about our customers and so forth. Financing is always going to be a piece of this conversation, right? So how are we going to have to get creative through PACE, through ESCO, through Energy as a Service, green funds? I mean, there's a lot of things that are coming out that that contractors and project developers need to make sure, how do we get people over the hump when it comes to financing? Again, Stephen mentioned that, document everything, right? I mean, and to me, I think this is an interesting, again, being in the business for 30 years, what I don't want to see is we get to 2030, and I guess the question is, how far are we going to be able to move the needle, right? If we're able to say that we reduced, energy use in the state of Colorado by 8%, I mean, in my career, that's a hell of an achievement. Maybe it's not 20%, but I think it's important that we all document our wins, because lawyers are coming, unfortunately. And then again, consider the service life of equipment, right? When it comes to embodied carbon of materials, we use that as the justification to not throw away perfectly good natural gas appliances, right? So making sure you're building your plans to say when equipment is ready to be replaced, do it differently. And the last thing I'll say is this, this is not LEED. This is not fill out a checkbox and you'll get a good building. LEED 10 years ago, right? This is results of the meter matter, right? I mean, the consulting industry doesn't like the word guarantee, but this is going to start to be, if you're going to give it out of scope to do a certain design or a certain upgrade, right? We need to be paying attention to how it affects the meter on the backside, because in the end, the state don't care, right? The meter is going to and it tells the state where the performance is, and the state is going to designate again whether you're in compliance or not. Again, why it's important to make sure that you're talking to the state about alternate compliance and what you're trying to do to get them there. But the meter's gonna be the final say, which is interesting. So with that, can we answer any questions?
One quick thing on the financing piece is I've got some members who are in that, the consulting space. And one of the things that they're finding that they're having to do is find somebody within your firm that can probably be that financing expert. Because what we're hearing is it's going to have to be a stacking of a whole bunch of different options around the financing piece. So, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act that you can get some money, 17D tax deductions, there's going to be all kinds of financing from the state, city and county of Denver. So having somebody that understands where to go get those so that your clients understand how to take advantage of that, because we had one of them that one kind of white paper that showed that it was actually going to be cheaper to electrify to get to the numbers than replace with natural gas, even though the replacement was less expensive on the natural gas side. There was a lot more financing that they were going to be able to get for that. So those are the kinds of things that are helpful.
Let's turn over to questions.